That morning, I spent more time than usual in front of the mirror. The house was silent, as it almost always had been in recent years. My husband had already left early, saying he had important appointments and might be back late. That no longer surprised me. In fact, what hurt most wasn't his absence. It was the feeling that, even when he was present, he seemed miles away. That afternoon, we were having a family lunch at my sister's house. There would be laughter, children running around the living room, crossed conversations, and that appearance of normalcy that, on the outside, made everything seem perfect. But inside, I didn't feel that way. I opened the wardrobe without much expectation, and my eyes stopped on a short skirt I hadn't worn in years. It wasn't anything extravagant. It was just a piece that, one day, made me feel beautiful, feminine, alive. I held the skirt in my hands for a few seconds. Did it still make sense to try to dress up like that? Did anyone still notice me? Or was I just trying to convince myself that that confident woman still existed somewhere? I took a deep breath and got dressed. When I finished getting ready, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. For a brief moment, I had the impression of rediscovering a version of myself that I had almost forgotten. A woman who still wanted to be seen. Who still longed to feel that her presence made a difference. On the way to my sister's house, my heart was strangely tight. I couldn't explain why. Maybe because, deep down, I knew it wasn't about the clothes. It was about everything I had been silently hiding. Lunch went by like any other. My sister talked nonstop, the children played in the yard, and the adults exchanged comments about work, bills, and routine. I smiled when necessary. But that smile no longer reached my eyes. It was then that my nephew, only 12 years old, entered the room and stopped in front of me. He observed me for a few seconds with that disarming sincerity that only children have. And then he asked in an innocent tone, "Auntie, why do you look so beautiful today and yet seem sad?" At that moment, I felt as if time had stopped. No adult had ever asked me such a direct question. No friend. Not even my husband. I looked at him, unable to answer immediately. My chest tightened, and something inside me began to unravel. Because sometimes, a sincere look from someone is enough to reveal what we've spent years trying to hide. I smiled to disguise it, stroked his hair, and said everything was all right. But it wasn't. And at that moment, I understood that that seemingly simple comment had touched a wound I had been trying to ignore for a long time. Without realizing it, my nephew had done exactly what no one else had managed to do. He forced me to face a truth I could no longer hide. After my nephew's question, something inside me remained restless. Lunch continued as if nothing had happened. The children ran around the yard, my sister served dessert, everyone laughed at old stories. And I smiled too, nodded, pretended to be present. But inside, those words echoed endlessly. Why do you look so beautiful today and yet seem sad? It was a simple question. Innocent. But it carried a truth I had been avoiding for years. On the way home, I drove in silence. The radio was on, but I could barely hear the music. My mind was trapped in memories I used to push to the back of my heart. When I married Marcelo, I believed I had found someone who truly saw me. In the early years, he noticed details that no one else did. He commented when I changed my hair, complimented a new dress, held my hand for no reason. I felt admired. Desired in the purest sense of the word. Important. It wasn't about appearance. It was about presence. About knowing that someone looked at me and saw more than a wife, a housewife, or a daily companion. He saw a woman. Over time, however, something changed. It didn't happen all at once. It was silent, almost imperceptible. Like a photograph that gradually loses its colors until only a faded image remains. Marcelo was still there. He would sit at the table. He would sleep beside me. He would ask if the bills had been paid. He would talk about meetings, clients, deadlines. But he no longer asked how I really was. He no longer noticed my silences. He no longer noticed when I spent more time in front of the mirror trying to recapture a version of myself that seemed to be slowly disappearing. I still wore nice clothes, but I no longer felt seen by the person who mattered most. And perhaps this is one of the most painful forms of loneliness. When the person who shares the house with you stops sharing their gaze, attention, and care. When love doesn't end dramatically, but transforms into habit, into routine, into coexistence. I remember many nights when Marcelo would arrive late, tired, and sit in front of the television while I, beside him, tried to start a conversation. I would talk about my day, about something I had felt, about fears that even I didn't fully understand. But, most of the time, I received short, distracted answers. As if my voice were just a background noise. Over the years, I stopped insisting. And, without realizing it, I began to fall silent. The strangest thing is that, to outsiders, we were the perfect couple. A beautiful house. Stability. Smiling photos on special occasions. But cracks don't always appear in the walls. Sometimes, they appear in the heart. That night, when I got home, I took off my shoes and sat alone in the dark living room. I ran my hand over the skirt I was still wearing and felt a lump in my throat. It wasn't the clothes that mattered. It was what they represented. A silent attempt to remind myself that I still existed. And, for the first time in a long time, I had the courage to admit a painful truth. My marriage was still standing. But the colors that once made it vibrant were almost gone. What struck me most that day wasn't the family lunch, nor the outfit I had chosen after so long. It was the simplicity of a question. A question asked without malice, without intent to hurt, but which struck exactly the place I had been trying to protect for years. After my nephew asked me why I looked sad even though I looked so beautiful, I tried to smile and change the subject. I said it was just tiredness. That everything was fine. But children have a sensitivity that many adults lose over time. They perceive what we learn to hide. A few minutes later, while everyone was chatting on the porch, he sat next to me on the living room sofa. He held a glass of soda in his hands and had the curious look of someone who still sees the world honestly. He observed me for a few seconds and asked, in an almost whispered tone, "Auntie, why do you dress up so much if nobody seems to notice?" I felt my heart skip a beat for a moment. It was as if the ground disappeared beneath my feet. Not because those words were harsh, but because they were true. I looked at him, not knowing what to answer. How could I explain to a child something that I myself had taken years to understand? How could I admit that, at some point, I had stopped feeling important to the person who should have noticed me most? I smiled, trying to contain my emotion. Sometimes, we dress up so we don't forget who we are, I replied, my voice breaking. He tilted his head, as if reflecting on it. But you're beautiful no matter what, Aunt. I just think you get sad when nobody says that. At that moment, my eyes filled with tears. Not because of the compliment, but because of the purity with which he had translated a feeling I couldn't put into words. For years, I tried to convince myself that I didn't need recognition. That maturity meant not missing affection, attention, small gestures. But the truth is, we all want to be noticed. We want someone to perceive our effort. To notice when we try to smile despite being tired. To see beyond appearances and reach what the heart silently begs for. My nephew knew nothing about my marriage. He didn't know about my lonely nights. He had no idea about the conversations that never happened, the hidden tears, and the constant feeling of invisibility. And yet, in a few seconds, he saw what I had been trying to hide from the whole world. Sometimes, the most transformative sincerity comes from someone who doesn't intend to teach anything. It comes from an innocent look. From a simple question. From someone who simply tells the truth without realizing the weight it carries. At that moment, I understood that I could no longer pretend. Because if even a child could see my sadness, it was a sign that it had become impossible to hide. That night, after I got home, I could barely sleep. My nephew's words kept echoing inside me like an old song that suddenly makes you remember everything you tried to forget. Why do you dress up so much if nobody seems to notice? I lay down next to Marcelo, observing the outline of his face in the dim light of the room. He slept soundly, as if nothing in the world disturbed him. And perhaps that was exactly what hurt me the most. The distance between us was no longer made of arguments or major conflicts. It was made of silence. Of habits. Of a coexistence so predictable that, little by little, it lost its color. I stared at the ceiling and, without realizing it, my mind began to wander to the past. To a time when everything was different. A time when Marcelo looked at me as if I were the most important woman in the world. I remember our first meeting as if it happened yesterday. I was nervous, trying to disguise my insecurity with a shy smile. And he, upon seeing me, remained silent for a few seconds before saying something I'll never forget. "You have a glow that's impossible to ignore." Back then, I believed him. And, more than that, I believed in myself. Marcelo noticed small details. He noticed when I changed my perfume, when I wore a new dress, when something worried me even without me saying a word. He held my hand at the movies. He hugged me in the kitchen for no reason. He whispered in my ear that I was beautiful even on the days when I doubted it myself. For a moment, I remembered the woman who once felt like the most beautiful woman in the world. Not because she had a perfect body, nor because she attracted the attention of others, but because she was loved in a way that made her blossom. In the early years of our marriage, our home seemed full of life. We laughed at simple things. We made plans. We spent hours talking about dreams that I can barely remember today. Time, however, has a silent way of transforming even the most intense stories. Responsibilities came. Bills. Work. Worries. And, little by little, we exchanged profound words for practical conversations. The good morning kiss became routine. Compliments became rare. Hugs stopped happening without reason. Until one day I realized I no longer knew when the last time Marcelo had looked at me with that same sparkle was. And perhaps the most painful thing isn't when love ends. Perhaps it's when it remains, but no longer manifests itself in the same way. When there is still affection, respect, history. But that essential detail that makes us feel alive is missing. Sitting on the same sofa, sleeping in the same bed, sharing the same life. And yet, seeming like strangers. In the darkness of the room, I felt a tear run down my face. Not because I wanted to go back to the past, but because, for the first time in many years, I had the courage to admit how much I missed that woman who smiled in the mirror. That woman who felt admired. Desired in the deepest sense of the word. Seen. And in that silent dawn, I understood that my greatest longing wasn't just for the Marcelo of before. It was for myself. The following night, I spent hours rehearsing a conversation I had postponed for too long. Marcelo arrived home around 10, as he did almost every day. The sound of the key in the door, once capable of making my heart race, had become just part of the routine. He came in tired, loosened his tie, and left his briefcase on the living room table. "Hi, love," he said, with a quick kiss on my forehead. An automatic gesture. Affectionate, but distant. As if we were repeating a script memorized so many years ago that we no longer needed to think about the words. I watched as he sat on the sofa and turned on the television. The lights in the room reflected on his face, but his attention was already elsewhere. At that moment, I realized that if I remained silent once more, nothing would change. I sat beside him and took a deep breath. "Marcelo, we need to talk." He lowered the volume of the television and looked at me with a surprised expression. "Did something happen?" For a few seconds, I was silent. My heart was beating so hard I could hear the sound inside my chest. How to summarize years of loneliness in a few words? How to explain that the problem wasn't a big mistake, but the silent absence of small gestures? I looked at my hands and finally said, it wasn't about the skirt. It was about everything I could no longer hide. Marcelo frowned, not understanding. Then I told him about the family lunch. About my nephew's question. About how those words had affected me. And for the first time in many years, I stopped pretending everything was all right. I said I felt invisible. That I still took care of myself, dressed up, smiled, kept our house in order. But I no longer felt that he truly saw me. My voice trembled, but I continued. I'm not talking about gifts or grand declarations. I'm talking about attention. About presence. About feeling that I'm still important to you. Marcelo remained silent. And that silence, for a few seconds, scared me more than any answer. I felt tears streaming down my face. The worst part is that I don't even know when this happened. I only know that, somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like a woman in your eyes. He lowered his gaze. For the first time in a long time, he seemed to have no ready answer. The television was still on, but neither of us paid attention. It was as if, finally, we were looking at each other without the distractions of routine. Marcelo ran a hand over his face, visibly shaken. I had no idea you felt this way. Those words provoked in me a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Part of me wanted to believe there was still time to rebuild what we had lost. Another part wondered how someone could love and, at the same time, not perceive the pain of the person beside them. That night, there were no screams. There were no accusations. Just two people sitting on the same sofa, facing a truth that had been silently growing for years. And, despite the fear I felt, one thing became clear. Sometimes, the hardest conversation isn't the one that destroys a relationship. It's the one that finally gives it a chance to be saved. Marcelo remained silent for a few moments that seemed eternal. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, as if he were mentally reviewing each year of our marriage, each night he arrived late, each interrupted conversation, each gesture of affection that failed to happen without him realizing it. I observed his face and, for the first time in a long time, I saw something different. It wasn't tiredness, nor distraction. It was guilt. When he finally looked up, his eyes were brimming with tears. "I think I lost my way," he said, his voice low and sincere. "And in the process, I ended up losing you too." Those words touched a part of me that still wanted to believe that the man I had fallen in love with was still there, hidden beneath the weight of responsibilities and routine. Marcelo took a deep breath before continuing. "I spent so many years trying to ensure stability, security, comfort, that I started to believe that was enough. I thought that by being here, I was already doing enough." He paused and clenched his hands tightly. "But being physically present doesn't mean being truly present." I felt a lump in my throat. That was exactly it. Marcelo had always been in the same house, at the same table, in the same bed. But emotionally, he seemed increasingly distant. "I didn't realize you were feeling so alone," he continued. "And that's something I'll carry with me for a long time." The tears I had been trying to hold back finally fell. Not out of anger, but because, for the first time in years, I felt he was truly listening to me. Marcelo moved a little closer on the sofa and spoke with an honesty I hadn't seen in a long time. "Sometimes, betrayal begins long before another person exists." The sentence hung in the air. And I understood exactly what he meant. Not all infidelity involves secrets, hidden messages, or someone from the outside. Sometimes, the real rupture happens when we stop caring for the heart of the person beside us. When work takes the place of conversations. When routine replaces admiration. When two bodies remain together, but emotions follow different paths. Marcelo wiped his face and continued, "I didn't betray you with another woman. But I recognize that I kind of betrayed the promise I made the day I married you. The promise to listen to you, to see you, to not let you feel alone." These words struck me deeply, because they were harsh, but true. And, perhaps for the first time, we were both facing our marriage without excuses. No masks. No illusions that everything was all right. That night, we understood that love doesn't always end abruptly. Sometimes, it's simply neglected until it almost disappears. But we also discovered something important. If two people can still speak honestly, acknowledge their mistakes, and allow themselves to feel again, then maybe not all is lost. And it was there, in the silence of that room, with eyes full of tears and hearts completely exposed, that the truth finally came to light. Our marriage wasn't over. But it would only continue to exist if we both had the courage to rebuild it. That night didn't end with a clear solution. There were no grand promises, no definitive decisions written in the air like in movies. After everything that was said, only silence remained, a silence unlike any other we had ever experienced. That time, it didn't seem empty. It seemed full. Full of everything we finally had the courage to face. Marcelo turned off the television without me asking. The sound of the house changed immediately, as if the atmosphere had finally lost a distraction that had hidden our truth for years. He leaned back on the sofa, looking at the ceiling, like someone trying to organize thoughts that no longer fit inside their own head. I remained seated beside him, but without getting too close. There was something between us that wasn't physical distance. It was emotional. A kind of pause in the life we knew. "I don't know how we got here," he said, almost in a whisper. I took a deep breath. "We don't arrive all at once. We arrive little by little, without realizing it." He nodded slowly, as if this answer made too much sense to be ignored. We remained silent for a few more minutes. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence full of understanding, as if we were finally allowing the truth to breathe between us. At that moment, I realized something strange. There were no more screams inside me. Only clarity. Fear. Yes. Doubt too. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving within my marriage. I was truly looking at it. Marcelo turned his face toward me. "Do you think there's anything left here to be saved?" The question hit me hard. Because it wasn't just about him. It was about the two of us. It was about what remained when all the layers of routine, silence, and distance were peeled away. I took a while to answer. Not because I didn't know what I felt, but because, for the first time, I was being honest with myself. "I don't know," I finally answered. "But I know we're still here. And maybe that already means something." He took a deep breath, as if that answer had opened a small window where before there had only been a wall. That night, for the first time in years, we truly listened to each other. Not just with words, but with attention, with presence, with what we had lost along the way. We didn't decide anything that night. But something changed. A small crack in the old silence that separated us. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the beginning of a difficult choice, to keep trying, or to learn to let go with dignity. Before going to sleep, Marcelo looked at me and said, "I don't want to lose you without trying to understand where we went wrong." And I didn't answer with certainty. Only with truth. Because, at that moment, the only thing I knew was that starting over wouldn't be easy. But perhaps, for the first time, it was still possible. After that night, I started thinking a lot about how life has strange ways of waking us up. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't a discovered betrayal. It wasn't a major event that changed everything at once. It was a question. A simple question, asked by a child who didn't even imagine the weight he carried in his own words. And perhaps that's the most impressive thing. Not all truth arrives dressed in drama. Some arrive in a low voice. Almost like a whisper. Sitting alone in the living room, in the following days, I found myself revisiting everything that happened. My nephew's question. The silence within my marriage. The conversation I postponed for years. And, above all, the moment when I finally had the courage to say aloud what I had always felt in silence. It's curious how we learn to live with our own pain without realizing it. We get used to the absence of compliments, to the lack of attention, to the fact that we are no longer noticed. And we keep telling ourselves that this is maturity, that this is normal, that this is adult life. But deep down, there's a part of us that never stops hoping to be seen, to be remembered, to be chosen every day, even in the little things. I understood over time that my story wasn't just about a marriage. It was about emotional invisibility, about how many women, how many people, live next to someone and still feel alone in their own home. And I also understood something else important. The problem isn't always a lack of love. Sometimes it's a lack of presence, of genuine attention, of looking with intention. Because being together isn't the same as being present. Today, when I remember my nephew's question, I don't just feel pain. I feel gratitude. Because he showed me something I couldn't see anymore. That I still existed. That I still felt. That I could still change something within myself. And perhaps that's the most beautiful thing of all. Not all truth comes from whom we expect it to. Sometimes it comes from an innocent look. From a simple phrase. From someone who has no idea of the power they carry when speaking the truth unfiltered. And that truth, however difficult it may be, can be exactly the beginning of a transformation. I don't yet know what the future of my marriage will be. I don't know if we will rebuild everything or go our separate ways. But I know one thing for sure. I am no longer the same woman who remained silent for so long. Because now I have learned something I don't want to forget. Sometimes, the person who awakens us isn't part of our love story, but helps us save it.